Eleanor moved through the quiet hotel suite with practiced efficiency, smoothing out the sheets, fluffing pillows, and straightening the small glass bottles of shampoo and lotion on the bathroom counter. She was fast but careful, the habit of years spent cleaning up after people who would never know her name. She adjusted the crisp white towels, tucked in the last corner of the bedspread, and stepped back to examine her work. Perfect. The kind of perfect that didn't get you tips but kept you from getting written up. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand. Almost noon. Her feet ached, her lower back throbbed, and she could already feel the familiar burn of exhaustion creeping in, but there were still 6 more rooms to go before she could pick up Theo from daycare. Maybe, if she was lucky, she could slip into the break room for a few minutes and take a sip of the coffee that had gone cold in her thermos. By the time she reached the next room, luck had decided it had better places to be. The guest had left a disaster, a trail of empty wine bottles, crushed takeout containers, and clothes flung haphazardly across the floor. Eleanor exhaled through her nose, already calculating how long it would take to scrub the sticky ring of spilled soda off the nightstand. She was halfway through stacking dirty plates onto a tray when her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Randall. "You home tonight? Need to talk." That was never good. Eleanor typed back a quick "working late. Tomorrow?" and shoved her phone away before the familiar wave of anxiety could settle in. Randall wasn't a bad landlord. He didn't raise the rent every year, and he responded when the pipes acted up. But a message like that wasn't the kind you ignored. The moment she stepped into her apartment that evening, she knew something was wrong. Randall was waiting just outside her door, arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't a large man, but his presence filled the narrow hallway. "Hey, Eleanor," he said, his voice stiff in a way that made her stomach clench. She shifted the grocery bag in her arms, glancing at the door like she could will it open. Theo would be hungry, and she still needed to help him with his reading homework before bedtime. "Hi. What's going on?" Randall sighed, rubbing a hand over his balding head. "Listen, there's no easy way to say this." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "The building's been sold." Eleanor blinked. "What?" "The new owners want to renovate. They're not keeping any of the current tenants." A strange ringing filled her ears. This had to be a mistake. She had paid rent on time every month. She was quiet, responsible. That had to count for something, didn't it? "How long do I have?" Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The words settled like a weight on her chest. "I'm sorry," Randall added, softer now, like he understood what he was taking from her. "I tried to push back, but there's nothing I can do. They're sending out formal notices tomorrow." Eleanor swallowed hard. "And there's no way to." He shook his head before she could finish. She nodded, gripping the plastic grocery bag so tightly that she heard the carton of eggs inside shift dangerously. "Thanks for telling me," she murmured, though she didn't mean it. Randall hesitated like he wanted to say something else, but instead, he gave her a small, apologetic nod and walked away. Eleanor turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, bracing herself against the warmth of home. The apartment was tiny, barely enough space for the couch, the small kitchen table, and the twin bed she and Theo shared. But it was theirs. The walls were lined with Theo's crayon drawings, the kitchen cabinets held the mismatched dishes her mother had collected over the years, and the scent of his bubblegum-scented shampoo still lingered in the air from his bath the night before. Theo sat on the floor, cross-legged, a toy dinosaur clutched in each hand. "Mom." He beamed up at her. "I made a volcano." Eleanor forced herself to smile as she set the groceries on the counter. "You did?" "Yeah, but it's invisible." He gestured wildly toward a spot on the rug. "It exploded and covered all my dinosaurs in lava, so now they have to escape, but the pterodactyl won't let them." She nodded like this was the most logical thing in the world. That pterodactyl sounds like trouble. Theo grinned and went back to his game, making loud roaring noises as he maneuvered the plastic figures. Eleanor took out a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter, her hands moving on autopilot as her mind raced. 2 weeks. That was nothing. She had some savings, not much, but enough to scrape by for a little while. The real problem was finding another place. Affordable housing in the city was next to impossible. Every listing she had seen was either too expensive or in an area she wouldn't feel safe walking through, let alone raising Theo in. She twisted the lid off the peanut butter and spread a thin layer onto the bread, her stomach twisting at the thought of pulling Theo out of daycare, switching schools, uprooting everything he knew. She'd figure it out. She had to. By the time she set Theo's sandwich in front of him, her face ached from forcing her expression to stay neutral. He took a big bite, swinging his feet under the table. "Mom, can we go to the zoo soon?" Eleanor ran her fingers through his messy curls. "Maybe, baby." "Okay." He chewed thoughtfully. "But I want to see the penguins first. They wear little tuxedos." She kissed the top of his head, willing herself to memorize everything, the way his hair smelled like shampoo and warm sunlight, the way his voice still held that slight babyish lilt, the way he trusted, completely, that she would always make things okay. She would not let him see how afraid she was. That night, as she lay beside him in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she went over her options again and again, but no matter which way she looked at it, the answer was the same. She needed a miracle. Eleanor sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a growing mess of cardboard boxes, old receipts, and stacks of papers that smelled faintly of dust and forgotten time. Packing had always seemed like an easy enough concept: put things in boxes, tape them up, done, but the reality was far messier. It wasn't just about moving things, it was about deciding what still mattered and what could be left behind. She sifted through a pile of her mother's old bills, her fingers brushing over faded ink and creased edges. Her mother had never been particularly organized, and now, looking at the chaotic mix of tax returns, letters, and outdated insurance policies, Eleanor realized she had inherited more than just her eyes and laugh. She had also inherited this mess. Somewhere in this heap, there had to be something useful. Rental agreements, employment records, anything that could help her when she inevitably had to prove she was a reliable tenant to some new landlord who would charge her twice as much for half the space. She pulled out an envelope marked Utilities, 2013 and sighed. Useless. Theo sat on the couch, swinging his legs as he played with his dinosaurs, narrating an elaborate rescue mission in which a T-Rex had to save a stranded triceratops from a lava pit made of crumpled-up newspapers. He was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them, and Eleanor wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. She reached into the back of the closet, where her mother's old coat sagged off a hanger, still carrying the scent of perfume. Behind it, her hand grazed something solid. She pushed the coat aside to reveal a battered, dust-covered box. It had no label, just a strip of yellowed masking tape holding it shut. She pulled it out and placed it on the floor, brushing away a thin layer of dust before prying it open. Inside, there were neatly stacked folders, different from the mess of papers scattered around her. These had been placed here deliberately. She recognized some of the documents immediately: her mother's birth certificate, an old passport, a collection of greeting cards tied together with twine. But at the very bottom, beneath a thick stack of medical records, was something strange. A folded sheet of heavy, embossed paper. She smoothed it out on her lap, her eyes scanning the text, the words not making sense at first. Title deed. The address was unfamiliar. The name, however, was not hers. Eleanor blinked, reread the document, then read it again. The paper felt real, the ink wasn't smudged or faded like something from decades ago. It was dated, 23 years prior. She swallowed, a slow unease creeping in. This had to be a mistake. She had never owned anything in her life. There was no way her name could be on something like this. She turned the page over, looking for a clue. A note, a signature that would explain why this document was buried in a closet instead of framed on a wall. But there was nothing. Theo, put your shoes on. He looked up from his dinosaurs, mid-battle. Why? We have to go downtown. Now? He made a face. But I'm busy. Me too, she muttered, stuffing the deed into her purse. Shoes. Now. The county records office smelled like old paper and government-issued frustration. A tired-looking woman in a maroon sweater sat behind a desk, clicking through something on her computer. The line ahead of Eleanor moved at a pace that could only be described as stubborn. She shifted from foot to foot, gripping Theo's hand to keep him from wandering. By the time she reached the counter, she was sweating beneath her coat. Hi, she said, pushing the deed across the counter. I found this in my mother's things, and I think there's been a mistake. The woman adjusted her glasses and took the paper. She looked at it, then at Eleanor, then back at the paper, her mouth pressing into a thin line. One moment. She stood and disappeared into a back room. Eleanor drummed her fingers on the counter, glancing down at Theo, who was now leaning against her hip, bored. Almost done, buddy. She wasn't sure that was true. The clerk returned a few minutes later, holding another stack of papers. I checked the system, she said, setting them down. The deed is real. The property was transferred into your name when you were 6 years old. Eleanor's breath hitched. That's not possible. It was placed in a holding trust until your 26th birthday, the woman continued, flipping through the pages. It should have been released to you 3 years ago, but it looks like there was an issue with the notification process. An issue? Eleanor repeated, stunned. Yes, it seems the letters were sent to your mother's old address before she moved. When they were returned, the case was closed due to non-response. But legally, the property is yours. Eleanor stared at the woman, her mind blank. What kind of property? A townhouse, the clerk replied. Historic. Located in the Gold Coast district. Eleanor felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. Gold Coast. The part of the city where people lived in homes that had chandeliers in the bathrooms. There must be some kind of mistake, she whispered. The clerk pushed the papers toward her. If you'd like, I can print a copy of the original trust documentation. It should outline the transfer of ownership. Eleanor nodded numbly. Minutes later, she was holding a folder filled with legal jargon she barely understood. But there, in black and white, was her name. She had spent her whole life moving, scraping by, living in apartments where the heat only worked in the summer. And now, she apparently owned a home in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Chicago. Theo tugged on her sleeve. Mom? Can we go now? Eleanor swallowed, gripping the folder tightly. Yeah, baby. We're going. Eleanor sat on the cracked vinyl chair in the county records office, staring at the folder in her lap. The words on the page had settled into her mind, but they refused to make sense. She owned a townhouse. A historic one. In the Gold Coast. The clerk, a woman named Maureen with silver roots growing into her dyed black hair, sighed as she tapped the papers. Like I said, the property was placed in a holding trust when you were a minor. The intent was for it to be released to you on your 26th birthday. Eleanor shook her head, still not looking up. But I'm 29. Yes, you are, Maureen replied, clearly unimpressed by Eleanor's math skills. The system shows notices were sent to the last known address on record. Since they were returned, the trust stayed in limbo. No claimant, no action. Limbo? Eleanor repeated. Like purgatory? If you want to get theological about it, sure. But legally speaking, the property is yours. You just never got the memo. Eleanor's mind reeled. Her mother had been gone for 4 years. If her mother had known, wouldn't she have said something? Wouldn't she have left Eleanor a note, a hint, a casual "oh, by the way, you own a mansion" over dinner? She pressed her fingers to her forehead. Is there any reason my mother wouldn't have known about this? Maureen pursed her lips, flipping through another file. Your mother wasn't the trustee. The property was placed under independent oversight, which isn't unusual for long-term trusts. The trustee's job is to ensure the legal process runs smoothly, but if the recipient doesn't respond, she shrugged. It just sits. Eleanor exhaled sharply. So, you're saying my mother might not have known? Possibly. Or she did know, Eleanor muttered, staring at the paperwork, and didn't tell me. The thought was like stepping onto a patch of ice she hadn't realized was there. Her mother had always been protective, sometimes to the point of suffocation, but would she have kept something this huge from her? Maybe she had meant to tell her. Maybe it was something she was waiting for the right moment to bring up. Then she had gotten sick, and the moment never came. Eleanor's stomach twisted as she considered the other possibility. That it hadn't been an oversight. That her mother had deliberately hidden it. She felt Theo shift in the chair beside her, resting his head against her arm. He was getting impatient. She was, too. She flipped the folder closed. Okay, she said, pressing her palms against her jeans. I need to see it. Maureen raised a skeptical brow. The house? The house. It's not exactly in move-in condition, Maureen warned. No one's officially maintained it in years. The property taxes were paid, but I don't see any records of renovations or occupancy. Could be falling apart. Eleanor let out a short, humorless laugh. That's fine. I'm a little broken, too. Theo perked up. Are we going to a house? We're going to look at a house, Eleanor corrected, pushing herself to stand. She tucked the folder under her arm and reached for Theo's hand. Let's go see what's been waiting for me all these years. The drive across the city was surreal. She had spent her whole life in the parts of Chicago where rent was high, paychecks were low, and you knew which street corners to avoid after dark. The Gold Coast was another world entirely. The kind of world where people walked tiny, expensive dogs and pushed expensive strollers with babies wearing tiny designer sneakers. As she turned onto the quiet, tree-lined street, she spotted it immediately. The townhouse. It was easy to find, not just because she had the address, but because it didn't quite match its neighbors. The homes surrounding it were polished, their exteriors gleaming under the afternoon sun, with flower boxes and crisp black shutters. This one was different. The paint was peeling. The wrought iron gate was slightly rusted. The windows were closed tight, curtains drawn, as if it had been abandoned by time itself. She pulled up to the curb, staring through the windshield. Theo craned his neck. This is it? Eleanor swallowed. Yeah, buddy. This is it. It didn't feel like something that belonged to her. It felt like a misplaced artifact, like a forgotten bookmark left inside a novel nobody had finished. She stepped out of the car, lifting Theo onto her hip as she pushed open the creaky gate. The steps leading to the door were solid, but the brass knocker was coated in dust. She hesitated for a moment before reaching out, pressing her palm against the cool wood of the door. She had expected something. A sign. A feeling. Some kind of familiarity. But there was nothing. She dropped her hand, exhaling slowly. Can we go inside? Theo asked, twisting to look at her. I don't have a key, Eleanor admitted. Then how do we get in? She didn't have an answer for that. She took a step back, glancing up at the townhouse again. Maybe the inside was crumbling. Maybe the floors had rotted out, and the walls were peeling. Maybe there were things inside she wasn't ready to see. But it was hers. At least, that's what the paperwork said. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk, gripping the strap of her bag as she stared up at the townhouse. It was grand in that old money kind of way: tall windows, wrought iron railings, the kind of door that probably weighed more than her entire car. It was also in perfect condition. No peeling paint. No signs of neglect. Someone was taking care of it. Someone who wasn't her. Theo, perched on her hip, squinted at the house. "This doesn't look like it's falling apart." Eleanor exhaled. "No, it doesn't. It should have been vacant." That's what the records had said: no official occupant, no history of rental agreements or recent sales. But there was a polished brass nameplate on the black iron gate that read "Private Property, no trespassing" in bold, capital letters. There was also a security guard. The man stood behind the gate, arms crossed over his broad chest, watching her like she was about to pull a crowbar from her bag and start scaling the fence. Eleanor shifted Theo onto the ground and straightened her coat before stepping forward. "Hi," she said, doing her best impression of a reasonable, non-threatening person. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." "No visitors," the guard interrupted. She blinked. "I'm not visiting. I own this house." The man did not blink. "No, you don't." Eleanor pulled the deed from her bag, pressing it against the gate. "Actually, I do." The guard finally dropped his arms, glancing at the paper with a distinct lack of interest. "You need to leave." Eleanor let out a slow breath. "I don't think you understand. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to speak to whoever is living here." "You can't." "Can't or won't?" The guard gave her a long, level look, then reached for the small radio clipped to his vest. He muttered something low enough that she couldn't hear it, then turned back to her. "Wait here." She watched as he disappeared down the driveway, the gates locked tight behind him. Theo pressed his hands against the bars, peering inside. "Is this our house?" Eleanor hesitated. "I don't know, baby." Minutes passed. 5, maybe 10. Eleanor shifted her weight, adjusting her coat against the crisp wind. She could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on her. She didn't belong here, not in her scuffed boots, not with her 6-year-old making dinosaur noises at the fence. The houses on this street weren't just expensive. They were old money expensive, the kind of expensive that came with inherited wealth and family names carved into university buildings. The guard returned. "Mr. Sinclair will see you." Eleanor squared her shoulders. "Mr. Sinclair?" The guard didn't answer. He simply pressed a button on the gate, and with a heavy metallic groan, it slid open. Theo clutched her hand as they followed the guard up the long stone path. The townhouse was even more impressive up close. The windows were tall, framed with black shutters. The door was dark wood, its brass knocker polished to a gleam. It swung open before they even reached the top step. A man stood in the doorway. Warren Sinclair was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked exactly like someone who had never once had a bad haircut. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his silver watch gleaming against his wrist. He didn't look at Eleanor right away. His gaze flickered briefly to Theo, taking in the boy's wind-reddened cheeks and the way he clung to her coat. Then, finally, his cold blue eyes settled on Eleanor. "I assume you have a reason for being here," he said. She lifted the folder, gripping it tighter than necessary. "I do." His lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Then by all means, let's get this over with." Eleanor sat stiffly on the edge of the leather chair, her back ramrod straight, hands locked around the folder in her lap. Across from her, Warren Sinclair leaned back in an armchair like a man entirely at ease, like a man who had never had a sleepless night in his life. The room around them was all polished wood and old money, tall bookshelves filled with volumes that had probably never been cracked open, a fireplace so perfectly maintained it seemed ornamental, floor-to-ceiling windows letting in the kind of natural light that made everything look even more expensive. Theo sat beside her, small fingers curled into the fabric of her coat, his wide eyes scanning the room. Eleanor pulled out the deed and set it on the glass coffee table between them. This property belongs to me. Warren's gaze flickered down, barely lingering on the document before he exhaled through his nose, almost amused. He reached for the papers, turning them over with the kind of disinterest someone might show to a grocery store flyer left on their windshield. This is outdated, he said. Eleanor's jaw tightened. It's not. Legally, it is. He closed the folder and set it back on the table. Whatever claims you think you have, they won't hold up. Her stomach twisted. You're saying this isn't real? I'm saying it doesn't matter. She felt her pulse tick up. That's convenient for you. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Let me save you some time. If you plan to pursue this, my lawyers will be in touch. And I assure you, they are very good at what they do. Eleanor didn't flinch, though she could feel her fingernails digging into her palms. That's it? That's all you have to say? Warren's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. What more would you like? An apology? A sharp heat rose in her chest. There was something about his calmness, the way he barely seemed surprised by any of this, that made her stomach churn. People didn't react this way to unexpected legal claims. They got defensive, they demanded proof, they called their attorneys. Warren Sinclair was acting like a man who had already read the last page of the book and knew exactly how it ended. Her mother had kept this from her. The city had lost track of her inheritance. And now, the man sitting across from her was behaving as if none of it had ever been in question. She straightened, pushing away the tremor of uncertainty in her gut. I'm not going anywhere. His expression didn't change, but there was something in the air between them, something sharp, something shifting. He nodded once. Then I suppose we'll be seeing each other again. Eleanor sat in the back corner of the public library, surrounded by a fortress of old newspapers and records, her fingers smudged with ink. Theo was across the table, using a stack of outdated National Geographic magazines to build what he insisted was a very important dinosaur habitat. She had bribed him with a bag of animal crackers and the promise of a stop at the ice cream shop later, but she could already feel his patience running thin. She had spent the better part of the morning searching for anything she could find on the townhouse, past owners, property disputes, tax records, anything that might explain how a home that was legally hers had ended up in Warren Sinclair's hands. It wasn't a simple clerical error. She was sure of that now. Warren had been too calm, too certain that she had no case. She flipped through another brittle page of an old newspaper, barely skimming the headlines, when a name jumped out at her. Everett Sinclair. Her breath caught. She had expected to find something about Warren. His name was everywhere, attached to luxury hotels, real estate, glossy magazine covers that painted him as a ruthless visionary. But Everett was a different story. She dragged the paper closer. The article was from over 30 years ago, a black and white photograph of an older man standing in front of the very townhouse she had been locked out of. He had a kind face, the deep-set eyes of someone who had seen too much but still wanted to believe in people. Everett Sinclair had been nothing like his grandson. She skimmed through the article, scanning for anything useful. It wasn't about business deals or real estate empires. It was about a charity he had founded, a program dedicated to providing housing for struggling families. He had been known for taking in people who had nowhere else to go, ensuring they had a place to stay, a way to start over. The townhouse had been a cornerstone of that work. Eleanor frowned. The article mentioned several families he had helped, but then the information stopped. No follow-ups, no later coverage. It was as if his name had been erased after his death. She reached for her notebook, scribbling down what little information she had. Everett had died suddenly. There was no obituary mentioning an illness, no long farewell. Just one article, then nothing. Theo yawned dramatically. Are we almost done? Eleanor ruffled his hair absent-mindedly. Almost, buddy. But she wasn't. Not yet. By the time she arrived at the Historical Society, Theo was fast asleep in the back seat. She parked in a spot shaded by a row of trees and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked tired, the kind of tired that wasn't just about sleep. Inside, the building smelled like old paper and lemon polish. A woman with silver hair and cat-eye glasses perched behind a desk, watching Eleanor with mild curiosity. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for records on Everett Sinclair." The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Everett Sinclair," she repeated, tapping her nails against the desk. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." Eleanor straightened. "You knew him?" "Knew of him," the woman corrected. "He was something of a local legend, until he wasn't." Eleanor leaned forward. "What do you mean?" The woman sighed, pushing back her chair and disappearing into a back room. When she returned, she was carrying a thick file, the edges yellowed with age. "These are the records we have left," she said, placing it on the counter. Eleanor flipped it open. There were photographs, Everett standing outside the townhouse, shaking hands with city officials, smiling next to families who had once lived there. But something was missing. What happened after he died? The woman hesitated. "That's the question, isn't it?" Eleanor frowned. "There's nothing here past 1993. The woman nodded. "Because after he died, everything stopped. His charities, his programs, gone, almost overnight. It was as if his work had never existed." Eleanor traced a finger over one of the photographs. "Who took over after him?" The woman hesitated, then said, "His son." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "And his grandson." She didn't need to ask who that was. She already knew. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she smoothed out the brittle newspaper clipping on the table in front of her. The photograph was grainy, the ink faded, but there was no mistaking the woman standing on the townhouse steps. Her mother. Young, barely out of her teens, her hands cradling the curve of her pregnant belly. She had never seen this photo before. Never even known it existed. The headline above it was small, tucked into the lower corner of the page, as if it wasn't meant to be noticed. "Local philanthropist expands housing initiative for families in need." The article was brief, too brief. It spoke about Everett Sinclair's work, his efforts to help struggling women find stable housing. No mention of names, no details about the girl in the photograph beyond a vague reference to one of many young women the Sinclair Foundation has assisted. Eleanor ran a thumb over the image, trying to reconcile the girl in the picture with the woman she had known. Her mother had always been guarded about the past. She had spoken in half-truths and deflections, always moving forward, never looking back. But here was proof that her mother had stood on those steps, carried Eleanor in her belly while living inside the townhouse she was now fighting to reclaim. The woman at the Historical Society watched her carefully. "You didn't know?" Eleanor swallowed. "No." She looked back at the photo, 1,000 questions crowding her mind. If her mother had lived there, why had they spent so many years scraping by? If Everett Sinclair had taken her in, why had she left? Why had they ended up in a tiny apartment with barely enough to get by? There was only one way to find out. The woman slid a slip of paper across the table. "I can't help you much more than that," she said, "but she can." Eleanor glanced down. The name Miriam Holt was scrawled in neat cursive, followed by an address in a quiet suburb just outside the city. "She used to work in the Sinclair household," the woman explained. "If anyone knows what happened back then, it's her." The drive to Miriam Holt's house was long and quiet, the back roads lined with bare trees and patches of snow that hadn't yet melted. Eleanor rehearsed what she would say in her mind, but the truth was, she didn't know how to begin. The house was small but well kept, a blue-shuttered Cape Cod with a crooked mailbox and a neatly swept porch. When she knocked, she heard the shuffle of footsteps, the slow creak of the door opening. Miriam was in her 70s, her gray hair pulled back into a loose bun, a knitted cardigan draped over her shoulders. She peered at Eleanor, eyes narrowing. "You must be her daughter." Eleanor's breath hitched. "You knew my mother?" Miriam stepped aside, motioning her in. The house smelled like cinnamon and old books. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you," Miriam said, settling into an armchair. "Your mother never spoke of what happened." Eleanor sat on the edge of the couch, gripping her knees. "What did happen?" Miriam exhaled, folding her hands in her lap. "Your mother was barely 17 when she came to live at the Sinclair house. She was scared, alone. Everett took her in. He took in a lot of girls who had nowhere else to go." Eleanor nodded, heart pounding. "But she was different." Miriam's gaze was steady. "Because she was pregnant with your father's child." Eleanor's fingers curled into the fabric of her jeans. "My father." "Warren's father," Miriam said. The words landed heavily, sending a sharp pulse through Eleanor's skull. "He refused to acknowledge her. Wanted her gone." Miriam's expression hardened. "Everett wouldn't allow it. He had his faults, but he had a strong sense of right and wrong. He was furious when he found out what his son had done. He told him that if he wouldn't take responsibility, then he would." Eleanor's throat tightened. "So he gave her the house?" Miriam nodded. "It was more than that. He put the property in your name because he knew his son couldn't be trusted. He wanted to make sure you had something no one could take from you." Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady herself. "Then why didn't we stay?" Miriam hesitated. "Everett died not long after. His son took over everything." Eleanor didn't need to hear the rest. She already knew. Her mother had left. Whether she had been forced out or had chosen to walk away, Eleanor didn't know. But the result had been the same. She had spent her whole life struggling, never knowing that, once, there had been a place for her. A place that had always been meant to be hers. Eleanor sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The wind rattled the bare branches outside Miriam Holt's house, sending dry leaves skittering across the pavement. She could still hear the woman's voice in her head, the weight of the truth settling into her bones. Everett Sinclair had fought for her. He had made sure she would have a home, a place that no one, not even his own son, could take away from her. And then he had died. Not months later. Weeks. Miriam hadn't been working in the Sinclair home when it happened, but she had heard the rumors. Everett had been in good health, still sharp, still active. Then, suddenly, he was gone. A heart attack, they said. But it had never sat right with her. People whispered about it, Miriam had said, lowering her voice as though someone might be listening, even now. That it was too sudden. That the timing was convenient. Eleanor had listened, her stomach twisting with each word. After Everett died, everything changed. His will was contested, dragged into legal battles that the public barely heard about. The charitable programs he had worked to build were quietly dissolved. The townhouse, her townhouse, became part of the Sinclair estate. And her name? Gone. She yanked the keys out of the ignition and leaned her head back against the seat, staring up at the gray sky. It wasn't just some bureaucratic oversight. It wasn't an unfortunate mistake, a pile of misfiled papers sitting in some government office. Someone had erased her. She turned the details over in her mind, the way a detective might examine the pieces of a crime scene. Everett had made sure the townhouse was hers. It had been legally transferred into her name when she was a child. That meant someone had gone through the effort of undoing that. Someone with power. And who had more power than the man currently living in it? Her hands clenched around the steering wheel. Warren. He had known. Maybe not when he was a child, but at some point in the last 20 years, he had learned the truth. He had found out that the house he lived in wasn't his by right. That it had been given to the daughter of the woman his father had abandoned. And instead of doing the decent thing, instead of acknowledging the injustice, he had buried it. He had made sure she never knew. She thought back to their conversation in the townhouse, the way he had barely reacted when she had handed him the deed. The way he had looked at her, calm, patient, like a man humoring someone he had been expecting to show up eventually. Because he had expected her. Because he had been waiting for the day the past would finally catch up to him. Eleanor didn't hesitate this time. She didn't linger at the gate, didn't let the imposing townhouse intimidate her. She walked straight up the steps, pressed the buzzer, and waited. The security guard from last time opened the door just enough to block her from stepping inside. Mr. Sinclair isn't expecting. He is, Eleanor interrupted, pushing the door open wider. And unless you want me making a scene right here in front of his very important, very wealthy neighbors, I suggest you let me in. The guard hesitated, then exhaled sharply and stepped aside. Wait here. Eleanor didn't wait. She strode past him, through the grand entryway, past the gleaming marble floors, the heavy chandelier, the kind of furniture that looked like no one was actually allowed to sit on it. She found Warren in his study, leaning against his desk, scrolling through his phone like he had all the time in the world. He didn't look surprised to see her. In fact, he barely glanced up before setting his phone down and giving her that same unreadable expression he always wore. To what do I owe the pleasure? Eleanor dropped the folder onto his desk, the papers spilling out. I know everything. Warren sighed and straightened, as if this were nothing more than an inconvenience. That's quite a statement. Your grandfather put this house in my name, she said, her voice steady. Because he knew what your father did to my mother. He knew she had nothing. He tried to make it right, but then he died, and suddenly my name disappeared from the records. Warren glanced at the papers but didn't reach for them. And? Eleanor clenched her fists. And you knew. He finally met her eyes. Did I? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Stop. Just stop pretending. You've known for years, haven't you? Maybe not when you were a kid, but at some point, you found out. And instead of doing the right thing, you buried it. You let my mother struggle while you lived in my house. Warren tilted his head slightly, considering her. Then, to her absolute fury, he smirked. Even if that were true, he said, his voice low, measured, almost amused, do you really think you can take this house from me? Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. I own this house. You have paperwork, he corrected. Paperwork that was overridden decades ago. Paperwork that means nothing if the right people say it means nothing. She wanted to lunge across the desk and slap that smug look off his face. Instead, she pressed her palms against the cool wood and leaned forward. I'm not going away. Warren didn't flinch. He studied her, his expression almost curious. Like he was trying to figure out how much of a fight she was really willing to put up. Good, he finally said, leaning back. That makes things interesting. Eleanor sat across from the lawyer in a small office that smelled like old books and burnt coffee. The walls were lined with binders, legal texts stacked so high they seemed to close in around her. The man behind the desk, Alan Berger, looked like he had seen every kind of case imaginable. His suit was slightly rumpled, his glasses sat low on his nose, and he had the tired but sharp-eyed expression of someone who didn't waste words. He flipped through the stack of documents she had brought, skimming pages with the efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. You have a strong case, he said finally, setting the papers down. Relief surged through Eleanor so quickly she almost laughed. Really? Alan leaned back in his chair. Yes. The original trust was valid. The deed was legal. And if your name was removed from the records under suspicious circumstances, that's grounds for legal action. Eleanor's grip tightened on her purse strap. So I can get the house back? Alan hesitated. And there it was. It's not that simple, he said. Your claim is legitimate, but proving it, winning, that's a different story. Eleanor's stomach sank. Why? Because the Sinclair family isn't going to roll over and let you take back a multi-million-dollar property without a fight, Alan said. Especially not Warren Sinclair. Eleanor exhaled sharply. Of course not. He has the money, the resources, and the influence to drag this out for years. He'll challenge everything. He'll make it expensive, frustrating, and exhausting. And in the meantime, his legal team will do everything in their power to make you look like a liar. Eleanor rubbed her temples. How? Character attacks. They'll paint you as an opportunist, someone after a quick payout. They'll dig through your past, looking for anything they can spin against you. Eleanor thought of her bank account, which contained just enough to make rent if she cut back on groceries. She thought of her long shifts at the hotel, the exhaustion that never fully left her bones. How do I fight that? She asked. Alan gave her a level look. With patience. With resilience. And with money. Her stomach clenched. How much? His silence was answer enough. The article started appearing within days. Unknown woman claims ownership of Sinclair estate, real or a cash grab. Hotel housekeeper says she's a Sinclair heir, experts call it legally dubious. Single mother versus real estate mogul, the battle for a Gold Coast mansion. The first time Eleanor saw her name in print, she nearly choked on her coffee. The second time, she forced herself to keep reading. The third, she threw the newspaper in the trash and kept moving. It didn't matter that the truth was on her side. Warren's legal team was relentless. Every article questioned her motives, subtly twisting facts to make her look like a woman who had stumbled upon an old deed and decided to try her luck at taking down a billionaire. They dug into her finances, pointing out how little she made, how unstable her living situation was. They hinted that she was looking for a settlement, that she had no real interest in the house itself, just the money it could bring. It was infuriating. But what made it worse was that people believed it. The whispers started at work. Coworkers who had always been friendly were suddenly wary. Strangers recognized her name when she handed over her credit card at the grocery store. Even Theo's daycare teacher hesitated when asking how she was doing, her eyes filled with the cautious politeness reserved for people who had become tabloid stories. And then came the legal motions. Warren's lawyers filed challenges on every possible technicality. They claimed the statute of limitations had expired. They claimed the original trust was invalid due to Everett Sinclair's questionable mental state before his death. They demanded excessive documentation, trying to bury Eleanor in paperwork. The stress was relentless. At night, after putting Theo to bed, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and notes, trying to make sense of a system that was designed to be impossible for people like her to navigate. And in the morning, she got up, got Theo ready, and went to work like nothing was happening. By the end of the second week, exhaustion seeped into every part of her. She missed a daycare payment, not because she didn't have the money, but because she had forgotten it was due. She burned dinner twice in the same night. She walked into the wrong hotel room during her shift and nearly screamed when she saw a guest sitting on the bed, staring at her like she was the intruder. She wasn't just tired. She was drowning. Theo started noticing. "Mom," he said one night as she tucked him in. "Are you mad at me?" Eleanor's heart cracked open. "No, baby. Never." He fiddled with the edge of his blanket. "Then why do you look sad all the time?" She swallowed past the lump in her throat and smoothed his curls. "I'm just really busy, sweetheart. But I promise, I'm okay." He frowned. You don't look okay. Eleanor forced a smile. Well, you look perfect, so I think that balances it out. Theo giggled, but the worry in his little face didn't fade. She kissed his forehead, turned off the light, and sat outside his room in the dark, her head in her hands. She had no choice but to keep going. Because the battle had only just begun. Eleanor had barely settled into her booth at the quiet corner cafe when the door swung open, and two impeccably dressed women stepped inside. She recognized them immediately, Vivian and Claudia Sinclair. Warren's half-sisters. She had seen their photos in magazines, always poised at charity galas, perfectly styled and smiling for cameras. Seeing them in person was different. Vivian, the older of the two, looked effortless in a navy wool coat, her dark hair swept up like she hadn't given it a second thought. Claudia was softer, more hesitant, her blonde waves framing a face that didn't seem as comfortable with the kind of power the Sinclair name carried. Neither of them had Warren's steel gaze, but there was something sharp in the way they looked at her as they approached the table. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, keeping her expression neutral. I assume you're not here for coffee. Vivian slid into the seat across from her. Claudia followed, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. We heard about the lawsuit, Vivian said, smoothing a napkin over her lap. Warren isn't exactly subtle when he's threatened. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Is that what I am? A threat? Claudia gave a small, dry laugh. Apparently. Eleanor studied them carefully. You don't seem particularly upset about it. Vivian leaned back, her nails tapping lightly against the table. Let's just say our relationship with Warren has never been warm. Claudia sighed. He likes to control things. Always has. And when he doesn't get his way, he makes sure no one else does either. Eleanor sat up straighter. So you believe me? Vivian's lips pressed together. We believe that Warren has spent his entire life rewriting history to suit himself. Claudia nodded. And we believe that if our grandfather meant for you to have that house, then you should have had it. Eleanor studied their faces, trying to gauge if this was some kind of trap. But there was no reason for them to help Warren. If anything, it sounded like they'd rather watch him lose. Vivian reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder, sliding it across the table. This is what we were able to find. Eleanor hesitated before opening it. Inside were a few old letters, handwritten and faded, all signed by Everett Sinclair. She skimmed the words, her heart pounding as she recognized the careful way he had spoken about her mother, about her. He had wanted her protected. He had wanted her to have a future. Claudia lowered her voice. We didn't know about any of this growing up. Warren made sure of that. Vivian folded her hands neatly. But we do now. And we want to see what happens when he can't bury the truth anymore. Eleanor took a steady breath. Because if Warren had been willing to erase her from history once, there was no telling what he would do next to keep things that way. And he wasn't going to take this loss lightly. By the next morning, it was clear that Warren had gotten wind of the meeting. A new motion was filed in court, this time challenging Eleanor's claim on the grounds of fraud. His legal team released a statement to the press, questioning her sudden appearance and calling her lawsuit an opportunistic attack on a grieving family's legacy. The message was loud and clear: Warren wasn't just trying to win. He was trying to destroy her. Eleanor clenched her fists. If that was the game he wanted to play, then fine. She wasn't backing down. Eleanor sat across from Warren in his office, the same office where he had smirked at her weeks ago, certain she was nothing more than an inconvenience. Now, there was no smirk. No easy amusement. Just a thick stack of papers between them and a silence so heavy it made her ears ring. You win, Warren said simply, tapping the folder. This is yours. Eleanor's fingers curled around the armrests of her chair. Just like that? Warren leaned back, his expression unreadable. Just like that. She didn't move. Didn't reach for the papers. This wasn't a victory. It didn't feel like one. What's the catch? No catch, he said smoothly. You drop the lawsuit. You sign a statement waiving any and all claims to the Sinclair estate. You take the house, and you walk away. Eleanor swallowed. The townhouse. The thing she had been fighting for, drowning under legal fees for, watching her life unravel over. And now, Warren was handing it over as if it were an afterthought. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt sick. She reached for the folder, flipping through the pages. It was all there in stark black and white, an offer so clean, so calculated, that no lawyer could argue with it. She would get the townhouse, free and clear. But she would also sign away any claim to Everett Sinclair's legacy. She rubbed her forehead. Why now? Warren tilted his head slightly. Because this has gone on long enough. You get what you want, and I don't have to waste any more time. You don't think I deserve anything else? I think you should know when to quit. The words hit harder than she expected. She had spent months fighting him. Fighting the machine that was the Sinclair family. She was exhausted. Every part of her wanted to say yes, to take the house and be done with all of it. But then she thought of Everett. She thought of the letters Vivian had given her, the careful way he had written about her mother, about her, his desire to make things right. She thought of her mother, who had spent her life believing that the world would never give her what she was owed. She thought of Theo, who would grow up knowing that sometimes, when something is stolen from you, you fight to take it back. She closed the folder and looked up at Warren. No. He didn't blink. No. Eleanor exhaled. You want me to take this deal because you think I'm tired enough to say yes. Warren said nothing. And you're right, she admitted. I am tired. I want this to be over more than anything. But I don't just want the house. I want the truth. I want Everett's name to mean something again. And I want people to know what your family did to my mother. A flicker of something passed over Warren's face, gone before she could name it. This isn't over, she said, standing. Not even close. She left the folder on his desk. And walked out. Eleanor wasn't expecting the phone call. By this point, she had learned that nothing about this fight would be easy, that the truth had been buried so deeply it might never fully surface. But then, out of nowhere, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and a voice on the other end introduced himself as Louis Carmichael. He had been a lawyer for the Sinclair family once. A long time ago. I'm retired now, he said. I don't owe them anything. Eleanor held the phone to her ear, heart pounding. Why are you calling me? A pause. Then, in a voice that sounded just tired enough to be telling the truth, he said, because I know what they did to you. The cafe where they met was quiet, the kind of place where people sat alone with their newspapers, nursing cups of coffee that had gone cold. Louis was already waiting when she arrived, an old man in a neatly pressed blazer, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug. You look like her, he said as she sat across from him. Your mother. Eleanor swallowed. You knew her? He nodded. Not well. But I knew what happened to her. She placed her hands on the table, steadying herself. Tell me. Louis reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, worn folder. He slid it across the table. Everett never trusted his son, he said. Rightfully so. He knew he wasn't a good man. That's why he didn't just leave the townhouse to your mother. He left something more. A fund. A financial safety net meant to protect her, and you. Eleanor's fingers hovered over the folder. But we never saw a cent. Louis sighed. Because after Everett died, his son made sure you never would. Her stomach twisted. The fund was real. I helped draft it myself. It was structured so that no matter what happened, the money couldn't be touched until you came of age. But after Everett died, his son contested everything. He claimed the fund was a mistake, that Everett had been mentally unfit when he set it up. He had judges in his pocket, people willing to sign off on anything. Eleanor opened the folder. Inside, there were pages of legal documents, handwritten notes in the margins, Everett's notes. "I don't know how far you're willing to take this," Lewis said, watching her carefully. "But I can tell you one thing. This was stolen from you." Eleanor clenched her jaw. "I want it back." She didn't give Warren any warning. She walked straight into his office, the folder tucked under her arm. The receptionist barely had time to protest before Eleanor pushed open the heavy mahogany door and let it slam behind her. Warren was at his desk, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up. Not now. Eleanor strode forward and dropped the folder onto his desk. "Now." Warren finally glanced up, his expression blank, as if she were a minor inconvenience rather than the woman threatening to unravel his entire world. "Another piece of paperwork?" he asked dryly. Eleanor opened the folder, flipping through the pages until she found the one she wanted. She turned it toward him. "This is from Everett Sinclair. Your grandfather." "My grandfather." Warren exhaled sharply through his nose, but he didn't move. "He left my mother a trust fund. For her. For me. And your father made sure we never saw a cent of it." She watched his face, looking for any sign of guilt, of surprise, but there was none. Just the same, careful calculation. "That was a long time ago," he said. Eleanor's hands curled into fists. "That money would have changed our lives. My mother worked herself into the ground, and we lived in tiny apartments and scraped by while your family, lived in our house, with money that was meant for us." Warren leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "And what exactly do you want from me?" Eleanor's breath was steady. "I want justice for my mother. I want my grandfather's name to mean something again. And I want everyone to know what your family did." For the first time, Warren looked at her like he actually saw her. Like maybe, just maybe, he had finally met someone who wouldn't back down. Eleanor knew Warren wouldn't go down without a fight. The moment she left his office, the retaliation began. It started subtly. Her lawyer, Alan, called her the next morning, his voice edged with frustration. "The judge we were scheduled to see? Suddenly reassigned. Our next hearing has been pushed back, indefinitely." Then her hotel job, the one that had barely been keeping her afloat, mysteriously cut her shifts. The manager stammered through an excuse about staff restructuring, but Eleanor knew better. Warren was pulling strings, making it clear that if she wanted to keep pushing, he could make things even harder. But the mistake Warren made, the fatal mistake, was assuming she had anything left to lose. By the end of the week, the story was everywhere. At first, it was a whisper, a few niche business blogs picking up on the lawsuit. But then one of Warren's own former associates, someone looking for revenge rather than justice, leaked the details to a major news outlet. Sinclair family scandal, secret Heir fights for stolen inheritance. Eleanor's face was suddenly everywhere. Online, in the papers, on talk shows dissecting the latest Billionaire drama. The coverage wasn't flattering. Some called her a fraud, an opportunist, a woman who had appeared out of nowhere demanding millions. But others dug deeper. They printed copies of the original trust, the documents proving Everett had meant for her to be taken care of. They unearthed old Sinclair family legal battles, painting a picture of corruption and cover-ups that didn't just hurt Eleanor, it shattered Warren's reputation. The press camped outside the townhouse. Investors started pulling out of Sinclair Holdings. Board members, once loyal to Warren, began asking questions. And Eleanor? She waited. She let the fire burn hot enough that when Warren finally called her, his voice was clipped, the first cracks of defeat seeping through. "Come to my office," he said. Let's end this. When she arrived, he was standing by the window, staring out at the city like it might offer him a way out. He didn't turn when she entered. You win, he said. She folded her arms. Say that again. I want to enjoy it. He finally turned, his jaw tight. You win, he repeated. I'll sign the new agreement. You get the house. You get the fund. And you drop this lawsuit. Eleanor held his gaze. And my mother's name? His brow furrowed. I want it public, she said. Everett Sinclair's name, the truth about what he did for my mother. You and your father buried his legacy. I want it restored. Warren's lips pressed into a thin line. He hated this. Hated losing. But he hated the alternative even more. Fine, he said. Eleanor reached for the pen on his desk and slid the papers toward him. Then sign. Eleanor stood at the iron gate of the townhouse, the keys cold in her palm. The fight was over. Legally, officially, indisputably, it was hers. And yet, she didn't move. The past few months had taken everything out of her. The exhaustion sat deep in her bones, like a permanent weight pressing on her chest. She had won, but victory didn't come with the triumphant swell she had imagined. It wasn't like the movies. No grand speeches, no satisfying final blow. Just a man signing a contract with clenched teeth, handing her the past like a transaction. Warren had barely looked at her when it was done. Enjoy your house, he had said, his voice flat. Hope it was worth it. No apology. No admission of guilt. Just cold acceptance. But he wasn't untouchable anymore. The press had ripped into him, the scandal eroding the carefully curated image he had built. Investors saw him as reckless, his family name now tarnished with lawsuits and betrayals. He would recover, people like him always did, but there would always be a stain. He had expected her to take the money and disappear. To walk away, grateful for whatever scraps he had been willing to throw at her. But she hadn't. She had made sure the truth was public. Everett Sinclair's legacy was restored, his name untangled from the lies Warren's father had wrapped it in. It should have felt like enough. But as she stepped through the gate and looked up at the townhouse, she thought of her mother. Of the life she should have had. She thought of the years spent in cramped apartments, of eviction notices, of making do with less because there was no other choice. She thought of Theo, waiting patiently by the car, his small hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching her carefully. This was his now, too. Not just a house. A home. The townhouse still smelled unfamiliar. The air inside was thick with the scent of polish, of old wood and something faintly floral, probably the last remnants of whatever high-end cleaning service Warren had hired to keep the place pristine. It wasn't her scent. Not yet. Eleanor stood in the foyer, running her fingers along the carved banister of the grand staircase. The house was hers, but it still felt like a stranger. A beautiful, distant thing she hadn't quite made real. Theo's footsteps echoed as he ran across the marble floors, his tiny sneakers squeaking against the polished surface. He had been quiet on the drive over, his little hands folded in his lap, his eyes darting from her to the house like he was waiting for something, waiting for her to tell him this wasn't another temporary stop, another place they would have to leave behind. She knelt in front of him, brushing a curl from his forehead. Do you like it? He glanced around, his gaze sweeping over the high ceilings, the tall windows, the grand staircase that curled up toward the second floor like something out of a storybook. His lips pressed together, as if he was still deciding. It's kinda fancy, he admitted. Eleanor laughed, a quiet, tired sound. Yeah, it is. Theo tilted his head. Do we live here now? She swallowed, the weight of those words settling in her chest. Yeah, baby. We do. They had never had permanence before. Every apartment had been a stopgap, a place that could be taken from them at any moment. She had spent years making sure Theo never felt that instability, but children always knew. They knew when their mom sat awake at night, counting money that wouldn't stretch far enough. They knew when a home was borrowed, not really theirs. This was different. The Sinclair family was still broken. Warren's siblings had reached out, quiet in their support, careful not to stir the already fragile tension. They weren't innocent, they had lived in comfort while she and her mother scraped by, but they weren't Warren. And Warren? She hadn't heard from him since the final papers were signed. No parting words. No last-ditch attempts to hold on to what he had lost. He had simply let her go. Or maybe, finally, she had let him go. She sat down on the staircase, pulling Theo onto her lap. "You finally have a home, baby," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his temple. "And no one can take it from you." He leaned into her, resting his head against her shoulder. Outside, the city hummed, the world continuing as it always did. But inside this house, inside these walls, they belonged.